Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience as we just figured out a few technical issues before we started today. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Joyce Barlow. I'm the Associate Director for Disability Inclusion at the University of Waterloo. And I am joined today by a few of my colleagues to support our discussion on inclusive physical space framework. And so I'll just turn it over to my colleagues so they can introduce themselves as well, starting with Matt.
Hello, everyone. I'm Matt Tyson. I'm Director of Sustainability here at the University of Waterloo. I'll turn it over to Christine.
Good afternoon. I'm going to learn to unmute. I'm the Manager of Design Services and Plant Operations. Our group manages the renovations and construction projects that happen on campus. Tanya.
Hello, everybody. I am Tanya Andrews, and my role is Manager in Counseling Services.
Great. Thank you all. Yeah, we're very excited to share with you a project that we've been working on for the past year, the Inclusive Physical Space Framework, and just a quick shout out to the Unmarketing Group for providing all the tech support that we are for this session today. So thank you so much for that as well. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get diving into our conversation. Just want to let everyone know that auto captions have been enabled for this meeting, and so you can find that in your settings. Some quick short keys in order to enable your full engagement with our conversation today. If you prefer to use keyboard controls as opposed to clicking with the mouse, there's a list of short keys posted up there for how to start and stop your video and mute your audio, how to raise and lower your hand and access the group chat. If there are any tech concerns, I noticed that a breakout room has been created that you can join for tech help, and please access that if you need additional tech support. Before we dive into the Inclusive Physical Space Framework, I just wanted to, in the spirit of reconciliation, acknowledge that the University of Waterloo, which is where all of us speakers are coming to you from today, which includes our Waterloo, Kitchener, and Cambridge campuses, are on the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee people, and our university is situated on the Haldeman Tract. It's land that was granted to the Six Nations of the Grand River. It includes 10 kilometers on each side of the Grand River. And our active work towards reconciliation takes place across our campus through our research, our learning, teaching, and community building, and it is coordinated through our Office of Indigenous Relations. And if you are outside of this area of what we now know as the Waterloo region, I also encourage you to find the Indigenous territories that you may be currently residing in and operating in. And I also recognize that through the important work that we do for realizing the SDGs, specifically goal number 11 calls on us to make our cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. And one way for us to realize this goal is to embark on a path of reconciliation and learn from the trauma we've created in our past so that we can build a better future. And so, with that, I just wanted to maybe share a quick intro about what this framework is that we're talking about, and just a little bit of background of the history at Waterloo that we've arrived to creating this framework. It started several years ago, I'm thinking 6 or 7 years ago, when Matt and I were the individuals that were hired at the university to manage for Matt sustainability and me accessibility. And so I think naturally in a workplace, when you are the one sole individual that's managing a big institutional portfolio, you try to find like-minded people and people who are going through the same thing. And what we quickly realized is that we're doing very similar things. Within sustainability and accessibility, we have to answer to various external building standards that have put in place, standards such as LEED, Passive House, the WELL standard, the Canadian Standards Association on Accessibility Requirements, In Ontario, we have the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, and we were trying to figure out how all these standards fit into our campus space. We also have a unique challenge in a campus climate where post-secondary environments are a bit different than how building standards are structured. We use our spaces in a multifaceted way, not just an office building or just a retail building or just a hospitality building, sometimes all of those in one building. So how do we manage that? And also the governance structure with how our physical space is designed is very different as well. We don't have an individual or a single point person or role or portfolio that makes decisions on our physical space. It is committee based. There's a lot of players that can and will influence the decision of how physical space is done, from our faculties to our administration to our donors. And so through some funding we received by the government of Ontario, we were able to create a project where we were really looking at where the intersections between sustainability, accessibility, and well-being happened. And the sole intention, or the intention initially, was to streamline it. Where were the overlaps? So we can streamline it and then present with one single standard to our consultants, to our building professionals, so that it was more efficient and effective. And what we found, though, along this journey was we were actually dealing with the same types of barriers and same types of challenges, just from a different lens or perspective. And three of those key underlying conceptual barriers was the idea of cost, like how much does it cost to make things sustainable and or accessible, or the well-being of our individuals. The idea of, having multiple things that need to be considered for one space, and how do you prioritize them? How do you manage the tensions? And then also this notion of future proofing. So our university, our oldest building was built in the 1960s. And we still use it today, but we use it for very different reasons than what it was initially built in the 60s, but we still have to make it work. So how are we going to do this with the additional pressures of the building standards and legislation and government requirements? And so that's where I think I'm going to set the stage of our discussion today. And with the first big topic, as we're all interested in, is cost.
Joyce. Yeah, so one of the largest challenges, particularly our group faces when we are approached about undertaking a renovation or construction project, of course, is how much does it cost? And so, in addition to sort of the battles that we're fighting against inflation and sort of the continual rising cost of material and labor, there's sort of the initial built cost of the project, but there's further costs that can manifest from a building project. So Matt, maybe you can shed some light for us on sort of what some of those true costs of the built environment are from your perspective.
Yeah, for sure. I think the estimates will vary depending on the type of the building and what it's used for, and a whole bunch of other factors. But when we look at the sort of life cycle cost of the buildings that we create, actually a relatively small portion of that is the actual purchase price to build the thing and get it up and running at the beginning of its life cycle. When we look at that, estimates kind of put that around 10% of the total life cycle cost, maybe another 5 to 10%, depending on the type of building, for like utilities and maintenance over the life cycle of it. And then 80 to 85% on the salaries of the people that are in there. So when you look at sort of optimizing your costs of building, any type of building really, if you're only looking at that first cost, you're missing really the long-term impact and the cost profile that building will have. So improving the productivity of the people that are in there, the health and well-being of the people that are in there, the energy efficiency of the infrastructure itself, might cost slightly more upfront, but might have a long-term value to any organization, but including institutions who usually have these buildings for a very long period of time. and that's often not priced in or thought about in the original cost profile. So we've been trying to do a lot more to make those factored into the decision making here at the University of Waterloo. Sometimes those are very explicit costs like energy, which we can quantify quite easily. Sometimes those are a little bit harder to quantify, like again, health benefits or productivity benefits. Some organizations do that quite well. And even if you can't, there's still a lot of anecdotal and kind of third-party research that's been done on this to kind of help validate that. And then there's other intangible costs like reputational benefit and risk management that also need to be thought of. And that touches a little bit on the future proofing. But I mean, if we're going to be designing buildings that need to last for 50 to 100 years, then we've got to think about, the policy and other environment that's going to be around 50 years from now. And it's going to be a lot cheaper for us to build that right the first time than to go and try and retrofit something to anticipate, for example, with decarbonization, what we're going to need to do in the future. So that's just my reflection on it.
Speaking from the wellness perspective, one piece that comes to mind for me is the human impact and the human cost. And looking at when we're creating spaces, are those spaces conducive to how far it is to get to the nearest restroom, or finding quality food for individuals, or even looking at the space create belonging and community for people, which can in long term impact sick leaves and people's ability to be in the space. And so these are some of the wellness considerations. Thank you.
Thanks. And if I might add, from an accessibility perspective, a lot of times I hear about how costly accessibility is, and a lot of times that is related to retrofit costs, and that comes from either valuing it out of the design consideration or not being considered at all. And so it's interesting because the Rick Hansen Foundation and HCMA Architecture and Design did a feasibility study of what the additional cost would be to build something that met Rick Hansen Foundation's accessibility certification level compared to the standard building code. And what they found that it was a 1% construction cost addition in order to build to that next level accessibility consideration. And when it was done at the design phase, it was actually a $0 increase. And so sometimes we always think about, things like how much it costs for adding a ramp to a set of stairs, but that's a post-design consideration in cost. So I try to, again, as Matt has said, to consider it at the beginning and build it right first. And the cost is actually much lower than what we would see if we were to consider it afterwards and have it as an add-on.
I do have a question here, Joyce. So the question is from Stephanie Antone. My concern around inclusive environment space is most spaces are not design friendly for those who are blind and low vision. How are materials chosen that can help improve accessibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are definitely guidelines in how to build for spaces that are friendly and accessible for people with vision loss. CNIB actually puts out a great guideline. It's called Clearing Our Path Guidelines. And a lot of it has to do with contrast between your flooring surfaces or contrast between one area to the next. And sometimes it's just a matter of selecting the right contrast between two flooring surfaces as opposed to adding specific warning strips or tactile indicators. And there's a lot of great studies out there too that talk about the different reverberation rates between concrete and cobblestone, or between gravel and those are things that would be a zero cost if you design them up front to look at the comparators and you pick the right flooring, carpet between tile. That's actually a zero cost. So again, it is a design strategy that you have to come with that in mind when you're selecting your materials up front, using the guideline of what that contrast ratio should be.
Thanks, Joyce. And thanks for your comment, Stephanie. I see here that you've added in the chat that you're a parent of a child with low vision or is blind, and that the guidelines are minimal. And so I think this kind of comes back to some of the things that we're trying to do with this framework. Granted, it's kind of within a limited scope, and we can certainly all be more conscious of it, but having those kind of conscious things at the forefront of our design aesthetic and in our minds as we kind of go through the design process is really helpful. I guess I'm touching on the next question a little bit, but it could easily get lost. So it's one of those things where if we're not consciously thinking of it and we're picking our colors and doing all of that, like Joyce said, a lot of those are zero cost. Like either way, you're going to need a floor, and either way, you're going to need a wall paint color. So how do you choose those carefully with these things in mind, as opposed to kind of coming up to it by accident later?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So actually, while we're on that topic, Christine, maybe we can just discuss a little bit further about, it comes across as challenges, right? You have one single space and you have all these different stakeholders coming at you with, sustainability requirements, accessibility and well-being requirements. And I'm sure there's other, the use of the building, those specific requirements of that purpose. So as an architect that's working on trying to create space and appease everybody's needs and requirements, how do you, what challenges do you see with designing space to try and meet everything that is required out of us?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly one of the biggest challenges that I often see is that the design process is a very fluid process. It kind of ebbs and flows, and it kind of changes along as we get more and more information through the design process. So one of the key things that we always start with when we're starting a project is, what are the parameters? What are you trying to design for? So by having sustainability, accessibility, and well-being sort of at the forefront and trying to define that fairly clearly with tangible targets is a challenging but very helpful thing. So if you set out your original guidelines with saying like, a sustainability is maybe a one that I can kind of point to. A lot of times projects are started with, we as the client consultant really care about sustainability. So we need you to think about that, which is a very easy statement to kind of slough off through the process of design if we aren't being quite specific about, what are our targets? What are we trying to reach? What kind of energy level are we trying to design to? So by kind of developing very clear and specific parameters at the forefront of the project, it becomes one of those other parameters that we're designing to. So as we're going through the design process and we kind of reach those regular checkpoints, we can come back to say like, okay, did we meet the requirement of 3 office spaces? Check. Yeah. Did we meet 3 meeting rooms? Yes. Check. Did we make all of the spaces accessible and easy for people with various abilities to navigate? Check. What are our sustainability targets? Check. Do we have good spaces that meet our whatever targets were set for well-being? Like, do we have kitchenettes close by so that people can take reprieve? Do we have? So by making sure that those targets are set up in the forefront and set up in the parameters of the project, it makes it easier for it not to get lost through the process. And then making sure that we have people who can kind of speak to those, preferably with lived experience, who can kind of share what their specific needs are. That can really help to set tangible targets. Matt and Tanya, I don't know if you can maybe share a little bit about some of the experiences that you've had, maybe even project specific, or how you might see it.
Yeah, I echo a lot of Christine's points on like from the sustainability perspective. I think for a long time, it was sort of LEED being the framework that a lot of people used, which has its pros and cons. And we've been trying in the most recent round of buildings that we're doing at the university to be taking much more of an intentional focus on energy and carbon targets, with absolute energy intensities and absolute carbon intensities as targets that are going into those projects. Because it does make it something that's much more sort of verifiable and baked into the kind of design process at multiple stages. So again, it's just a good example of being clear up front. And the consultants that were brought on the design team to actually build these things, that was kind of communicated right from the RFP through each of the different design briefs for some of the buildings we're working on right now. So the clearer you can get, I think the greater the level of success you'll have. And I think the inverse is true. When we start thinking about sustainability, accessibility, well-being, and any other building consideration, that can become a really long list. And as soon as you start getting ambiguity in that or confusion around what's actually meant by these different terms, that can, I think, add a lot of complexity or delays to a project that probably will have unintended outcomes, or you're not entirely clear on what you're actually designing to. So yeah, I would agree. Just the clearer you can make things up front, the better. And the opposite being the challenge of complexity and confusion.
Thanks for that, Matt. And also thinking about things that add time, but are so important to the process, and in speaking with people with lived experience in a variety of ways, whether that's accessibility, whether that's wellness, whether that's Indigenous spaces, Indigenous knowledge bringing into the space is really important as well. And thinking about smudging and how to be able to access smudging with the different parameters there are in buildings. So when do you bring somebody in? Do you bring them at the beginning? Do you bring them at the end? It does add more time, but hopefully in the long run, being able to get this and respect the different people that are going to be in the space is a really important part of the process. And so thinking through, it's really great to be able to say that all are welcome in a space, but looking at how can we create spaces where people can come and say, this was built with me in mind, is a really important perspective from someone entering a space and feeling belonging.
Tanya? Yeah, and just one, I guess, last piece I kind of wanted to add to that was just the acknowledgement of how challenging it really is to meet all of those different parameters. And I think one of the goals of our framework was not really so much to pass judgment on what's better or what's worse. I mean, there's going to be times when you do need to make a compromise in a particular area because something else that is more highly valued or is more important to the project gets kind of pushed to the forefront. And I think that those compromises just need to be made with understanding and intention so that we don't end up with sort of a, I call them a whoops, like you get to the end of it and you're like, whoops, I made my entrance on the second floor and now I need to create giant stairs and ramps to get to it. So I think the goal of that framework is to ask a series of questions so that whatever decision you land on can be an intentionally made decision with the full understanding of I compromise this in order to achieve that, so that you don't end up with these whoops along the way.
Yeah, and I'll do a quick add into that too. Aside from the whoops factor is, just understanding that when you're planning, there are limits to what you can do at the design front. But if you're aware of where those compromises happen, maybe there's a plan in the future at post-occupancy stage or at a service delivery stage, if this is a public space, that you can help overcome those without having to clamor to say, oh, well, the space wasn't designed, so we're going to add extra things. And then it comes across as this building wasn't designed with you in mind. So it's more about seeing everything, be very clear again to what you're looking for, and then planning accordingly, right from design all the way to post-occupancy, even up into maintenance, to make sure that you capture it in a thoughtful way as opposed to as Christine very scientifically terms it, as a whoops way. And so maybe that leads to that third piece that we were talking about, is that whole idea of implementing a design strategy that might meet the needs of today, but maintains relevance for years to come. We all know that whatever buildings or physical space we design today is going to last well beyond our lifetime. So how do we manage that design? How do we try to meet all those immediate needs right now, but also have that future planning in place? So Christine, do you want to take that on first?
Sure, I can start. I think it's always difficult. Like, there is no such thing as designing with a crystal ball. You can really only do your best guess. But I think there are certain things that you can kind of plan ahead for. So even when it comes to designing the building to meet your needs, it's helpful to not just have needs for the day of, but also, where does the university, in our case, where would the university want to be in 15 years, 20 years? And how do we foresee this building being used? What kind of research are we trying to accommodate? And research is one of those particularly challenging ones where, like Joy said, our first building was built in the early 1960s, late 1950s. And so, battery test cell research was not a thing then. And so now how do we try to accommodate that? And I think a lot of it comes down to making sure that we're building a building that has durability. So building with the good quality materials, accommodating for service space, accommodating for sustainability features, and just making sure that we leave space in the design for those kinds of things. A lot of times what we struggle with is it was designed so purposeful for that moment, and then when budgets come up, a lot of times those extra fluff spaces, or what is seen at the time as a fluff space, that additional service corridor, or whatever the case might be, that extra lounge for students or whatever, those things get cut from the project as costs kind of put a constraint on it. So it does help to have this sort of sense of a future proofing in mind, that it may cost a little more today, but what does it mean to actually own these buildings, and where do we want it to look like in 15, 20 years, not just the day it opens.
I'll just add to that. I think on the building itself and how it's going to be used, I think Christine's right. We don't have a crystal ball on what that's going to look like in any perfect sense. I think when we look at some of the external factors from a environmental sustainability perspective, we know, what the trends are in terms of climate change, that the buildings, in terms of how they need to be heated and cooled today, might look different than what they do 30 years from now based on that. And so how are we designing the envelope and the mechanical systems that can accommodate that, expected level of change? We know energy prices are likely to continue increasing one way or another. So how are we factoring that into the decision making, that it's not just the cost of energy today, but also looking to the future? So I think it's really just stepping back and taking that lens on some of those major trends that we're seeing, and making sure that the building or the built infrastructure is able to sort of respond to those. Maybe that means there's some redundancy built in, that, things are sized a little higher or lower in order to be able to accommodate what might come down the road. And again, that sort of marginal cost increase today could save you a lot of, retrofit money down the road from not having to do it again.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there quickly too to talk about anthropometrics. So in accessibility standards, a lot of it is based on anthropometrics of what average body size is. How they come up with that is actually based off the adult population, which is ages 16 to 64. And I was just recently on the StatsCan website, and 15.6% of our population is actually aged 0 to 14, and 18.8% of them are actually over 65. And so what we're actually doing is building to an optimal human condition for a very small subset of the population. And when I think of future proofing, it's, that doesn't seem very economical to me, because we know we will have young people. We know we will have older people. We know that not everybody functions on an optimal level every single day. So can you imagine if we built to a suboptimal human condition, how much more we can allow for leniency and flexibility for people to interact with our built space, even if they are experiencing a temporary disability. And I include temporary disability in situational stuff, like when you arrive to a door with a coffee mug and a laptop bag. How do you then open the door, right? So let's plan for those instances now because we know it will happen, in order to ensure that we don't have to try and figure it out later, because the human condition doesn't change, the human needs don't change as much as what we value as how to use built environments. So we can use that as a steady state. All right, so we've had a lot of discussion just amongst ourselves. I'd like to give some time, open it up for questions or comments or feedback from the audience in the last, for the next 5 or so minutes, and then I'll save the last 5 minutes to share a little bit more in depth of what our framework looks like and how you may be able to access that framework.
No additional questions in the chat at this time, Joyce.
Okay. All right, so while people are taking time to try to formulate their responses, maybe I will just jump ahead and I'll flip this a bit and share a bit about the actual framework and what it may look like. So the goal of our framework, after we've done the full environmental scan of all the different standards and how they integrate, it really comes from a place of having informed decision making. So the framework we're creating is essentially, it's a curated set of criteria on taking on a holistic perspective of how to build physical space that has accessibility, well-being, and sustainability in mind. And so, in falling short of writing a whole textbook, what we tried to do was look at anytime there was an intersection between at least 2 of these 3 areas, sustainability, well-being, and accessibility, we would capture that and say, look, this is one area that if you look at it more holistically, you can actually capture 3 things. So I think of things like windows. That's one that cuts across all 3 spaces, or 3 areas. So that's how our framework is structured. And some of the key areas you'll see in the table of contents when it comes out, it will address things like site orientation and massing, product and material selection, indoor air quality, thermal comfort, visual comfort and lighting, acoustics, wayfinding, operations and maintenance, and the notion of circular economy. So those are the 9 key areas that this framework will look to address. As you can imagine, there's a lot of work involved. We are currently drafting. We are hoping for a launch at the end of June to release this framework. It will be available as an open resource document that will be posted on our University of Waterloo website. And you can just search it up as an inclusive physical space framework, and it will be available for you to download and access. If you want I guess a direct reach out to let you know when it is published, please feel free to send us an email at inclusive.space@uwaterloo.ca. And we can certainly add you to the list of, our soft launch flag of, it's published, it's available, but that is our intention to make it an open resource. And we recognize that there are, just based on timing and funds, there's limits to what this framework does. And we're hoping this is a kickstart to many more conversations. Hopefully we can have like a phase 2 to look at a lot of other things as well that we haven't captured. So we see this as a start of a new way, a new mindset, and a new way of designing, and certainly not the end state. So with that, we have 5 minutes, and I'll just maybe go back to turn it back to Tanya to see if we have any questions or comments floating in.
We do. We have one question and a couple comments. I'll start with a question from Leslie. Do you do mapping of usage in current buildings, and is there software that does that?
I'm not 100% familiar on the software that we've been using. I have seen data of when buildings are primarily occupied. I believe what we're using is a connection to our Wi-Fi, connection to EduRoam to do that. Matt, do you have additional insight on that?
No, you're right. It's based off of the Wi-Fi connections right now, but I was just curious, did they mean was the question about occupancy levels, or was it more about mapping of like where in the building and wayfinding, because I think that could come from a different perspective. I don't think we have any of the latter. But like Christine said, we do have occupancy levels that are kind of tracked and recorded based on internet connections, Wi-Fi connections.
Okay. Yeah, Leslie, I see you commenting here, movement of people in the space at times and usage. Yeah, so we have some very high level data at the University of Waterloo. I would certainly say it's probably not, it really doesn't dig into some of the nuances of to make it fully useful. But we have a little bit of data, and that's really just based on the EduRoam, the Wi-Fi connection. So
we had a couple comments here. One was from Aditi. No questions. This has been very insightful. Thank you. Thanks for that feedback, Aditi. And the last comment here is from Stephanie. There are some talented Indigenous architects. Hope that they have been consulted or will be consulted.
Yeah, we certainly have. We have a Office of Indigenous Relations here on campus at the University of Waterloo. And it's part of our requirement to kind of consult with them as part of major projects. Of course, that team of people are not necessarily design trained, and we have connected with Indigenous architects for Indigenous specific related projects, or have asked that the prime consultant be consulting with Indigenous architects or Indigenous consultation.
I will just add to when I mentioned about the scope of our framework and how it is somewhat limited in phase one, is that the first chunk, I guess, that we could take on is what existing building standards are out there to address possible tensions based on these curated standards that certain legislative bodies have decided that this is what you should build to. And so unfortunately, we don't necessarily have that as a building standard from an Indigenous perspective, but I certainly hope that in phase two, when we have the capacity and resources to look into other just approaches to design that can bring this more into a more robust framework, to include that, because I do think it is important, but we're kind of strapped for time and resources to really have to somehow scope it out at the initial phase.
There's one last comment here from Leslie. Love this conversation. We are doing some work on sports and physical education framework and its application to FN learning facilities, and whose physical culture is being and has been applied to its design. That was from Leslie. Thank you for that, Leslie. And that is our comments and our questions. Over to you, Joyce.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for the questions and the comments. Very insightful and things for us to take away and think about as well. Again, if there are any additional comments as you carry on with this conference, please feel free to reach out to us at inclusive.space@uwaterloo.ca. And we hope that in the future, we will have ongoing conversations and hopefully further collaboration, and we can bring in a more robust framework in the years to come. Thank you, everyone.